Hearing on House Bill 2629, and we'll begin with the bill brief.
Thank you for your patience, Madam Chair. Good morning, committee. House Bill 2629 requires the Secretary for Health and Environment to provide a death certificate of a child to the State Child Death Review Board and increases the number of board members, allowing for compensation and providing for the disclosure of certain records to certain persons for securing grants. The bill comes to us from the House Committee on Child Welfare and help me out here, Jenna. Child welfare, and amends multiple statutes relating to the State Child Death Review Board, review of child deaths, records, and coroner and law enforcement protocols. Section 1 of the bill amends KSA 22A-242, the statute that governs procedures for a child death. The bill eliminates the requirement that a coroner sign a non-suspicious child death form after an investigation and autopsy. The coroner would no longer be required to notify the board within 30 days of the investigation and autopsy. The coroner is currently required to attempt to notify any parent or legal guardian of the child prior to an autopsy. The bill would require that such notice contain information about the autopsy and instructions on how to obtain a copy of the findings and results of the autopsy. A new subsection would require the Secretary for Health and Environment to provide a copy of the child's death certificate to the State Child Death Review Board. Section 2 amends KSA 22A-243, the statute that establishes the State Child Death Review Board. The board membership would be increased to include one more member appointed by the State Board of Healing Arts, and that person would be required to be a physician licensed to practice medicine and surgery, specializing in pediatrics. A new requirement would state that the charge of the board to review all child deaths of Kansas residents under 18 years of age or non-residents under 18 years of age whose death occurred in Kansas. The section would allow for compensation, subsistence allowances, mileage, and expenses for members subject to the approval of the chair and the Attorney General. The board would allow disclosure of board records to, quote, any person or entity if the information and records being disclosed are statistics or conclusions of the State Review Board and provided with the purpose of procuring and maintaining financial grants. Section 3 amends KSA 22A-244, directing the State Board to maintain records for at least 15 years after the date a case investigated by the board is closed. The section would no longer require that the board transmit a copy of the board's written report to the county or district attorney of the county or of district where the child was a resident or when the death occurred. In committee, the House Committee on Child Welfare and Foster Care amended the bill to allow for the disclosure of the board's conclusions and statistics to the governor and the legislature to supplement the board's annual report to those parties. The House Bill 2629 passed the House Committee of the Whole on a vote of 119 to 1 on February 22nd. And if enacted, the bill would become effective on July 1 of this year. And I can stand for questions.
Committee, do we have questions for Eileen? Seeing none, thank you. We will begin with proponent testimony from Sarah Hortenstein.
Welcome, Sarah.
Thank
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of House Bill 2629. Again, my name is Sarah Hortenstein, and I serve as the Division Chief for Youth Services at the Attorney General's Office, as well as the Executive Director of the Kansas Child Death Review Board. That position I have held for the last 9 years. As a brief overview, the State Child Death Review Board was created by the legislature in 1992 and is administered by the Office of the Attorney General. The board examines the circumstances surrounding all children under the age of 18 who die in Kansas, as well as the deaths of any Kansas children when notified who die in another state. On average, the board reviews nearly 400 child deaths per year, which includes the analysis of the child's medical records, law enforcement information, autopsy findings, and a variety of other pertinent information. Through the extensive and comprehensive review, the board is able to identify and understand the circumstances regarding the child at the time of their death. And from there, the board collects and analyzes our data to identify patterns, trends, and risk factors related to the deaths so that we may inform public policy within our state. Given the board has been in existence for over 30 years, it's reasonable that some of the statute that originally was drafted in the 90s needs a bit of freshening up. And as introduced, House Bill 2629 will modernize outdated language as well as codify current practices and notifications between our board and coroners, as well as other agencies such as KDHE and DCF. In addition to the general cleanup of the bill, House Bill 2629 has two provisions which both have a positive impact for our board members. The first provision would authorize an additional appointment from the Board of Healing Arts. This would add some additional expertise for the review of these deaths, as well ensure that overall case assignment is at a manageable level for each of our appointed board members. The second provision would allow compensation for the board members to attend our monthly meetings, which is consistent with other practices of other boards and addresses some of the barriers we have found as it relates to finding suitable appointments to the board when some of those interested parties sometimes live several hours from the location where we host those meetings. Lastly, as introduced, House Bill 2629 will allow the board to disclose statistics or conclusions for the purposes of procuring or maintaining financial grants. This added disclosure will allow the board to meet some of our federal funding requirements of our existing grants, as well as ensure that we have competitive application for future grant opportunities. When this bill was heard in the House Committee on Child Welfare and Foster Care, we requested that an amendment be made which would add additional disclosure allowance to the governor and the legislature if the information and records being disclosed were statistics or conclusions of the State Review Board and provided for the purposes of supplementing the State Review Board's annual report. Currently, our state statute restricts us from disclosing conclusions or statistics outside of that annual report, which we submit to the governor and the legislature on or before October 1st each year. The requested amendment included in this bill would allow the board to keep our annual report at a manageable length without having to compromise some of the level of information or statistics data that we report out to the public, as well as legislative committees such as this. So in conclusion, I just want to share that the work of the board is commendable and absolutely needed to ensure that as a state we're aware and responsible of the risk factors associated with child deaths. And as written, House Bill 2629 is an important to the overall success of the board. With that, I would be happy to stand for questions. Thank you.
Questions, committee? Senator Steffen.
Thank you. I'm looking at the bill. Page 2, line 7, you probably, I don't know if you have it in front of you, but it looks to me like there's steps being taken to make it harder for parents or certainly less accommodating for the parents to get results. What's the upside to doing that?
Yeah, we have found that in speaking with families, speaking with coroners across the state, when a child passes away, a lot of times the information that they're receiving initially is just sometimes overwhelming when it comes to the autopsy and how to handle that. And so coroners has found the more empathetic approach is to give that information to the family, help them understand how they can receive that autopsy report and the conclusions and kind of a timeline for when they could expect that. Some families have been caught off guard when coroners, they feel like the autopsy is completed and they know the instructions, but then when it's re-brought up to them 6, 8 months later that it's in, it can be confusing and upsetting to families who who maybe didn't want to know that it was in. The closure being re-brought up is troublesome for them. So this streamlines the process, and it was requested by coroners for the last few years to our board.
Follow up. I don't understand how it streamlines the process. It creates a break in the process.
Thank you, Senator. Our perception from what we've heard from coroners is that this has been a more friendly approach to give the information all at once, despite having to make another disclosure again later, if maybe the family wasn't wishing to be told of that. That is what we have been working with coroners with.
When you read it as written, it basically does away with any responsibility of the coroner helping the family understand immediately what was going on, what happened. And it puts the family in a position where they can't gain access to it for a period of time. Again, there's a discongruency between what you're saying and how this reads. And is it a wording problem in the bill?
Senator Stephan, would you remind me what line you were talking about? I'm trying to find it.
Page 2, line 7. 8,
Thank you.
in that whole paragraph, that whole D is where it's at.
Did you have additional questions, Senator Stephan?
I thought I had. I just continue to be very concerned that I'm not clear on what the intent of the change was. But I think when you read that paragraph from a legal standpoint, it's creating a gap between the coroner and the family. And I'm trying to figure out if that's what was intended or not. But I found it problematic when I read it last night, and it continues to look problematic.
If I may, the way I read this, and could you correct me if I'm wrong? I didn't mean to interrupt you, Senator Stephan, had you completed your questioning. The coroner shall attempt to notify any parent or legal guardian of the deceased child prior to performance of the autopsy and attempt to notify any such parent or legal guardian of the results of the autopsy. Are we saying they don't want to contact them? They would just say, here's how you can get a copy?
What it means is that instead of notifying the parent initially to say an autopsy will be performed on your child, this is what will happen, and then when the autopsy is complete, which can be sometimes 6 months to a year later after the child's passing, that sometimes that autopsy report is final, that instead of that coroner reaching out to the parent to say, okay, now the report is final and you can access it, with your county clerk's office or from that entity. It is now saying that all of that information will be given to the family in a very sympathetic and empathetic way to that family all at once, so that they have that information and they kind of know the expectations and the timeline for what will happen and how they can get that autopsy report throughout that whole process without having to wait until the autopsy report is final, sometimes 6 or 8 months later, and then reintroducing that to the family. Coroners are always taking calls from families, and when families request, is there updates, they provide those updates and let them know kind of an updated timeline for when they could expect that autopsy report, and would continue to communicate with that family when they requested. This would just streamline the process, I guess, in a way that I meant that not every family would receive now 2 notifications if that second notification wasn't of their wishes, to know when that autopsy report was final.
Thank you. Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it seems to me that removing an attempt to notify any such person, parent, or legal guardian of the results of the autopsy is a good change, and the addition of the notification, because not having been in that situation, but it is a very traumatic time for families, and at least they have the information up front as how they can follow through.
Additional questions, Senator Thompson.
Yeah, I think that confuses it even more because in that section D, with the amendment, seems to be just talking about what happens prior to the autopsy, but doesn't address providing, as it previously was written, it talked about what happened prior to the autopsy and then letting them know what happened with the results of the autopsy. By taking that out, the stricken part just deals with what happens prior to the autopsy, notifying the parents how they can get the information once the autopsy is completed. Is there somewhere in the bill later on that requires, and I'd have to scan through because I've been focused on this, that requires the autopsy results to be provided in a speedy fashion to the parents? And
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Senator, Madam Chair. So when a family has a child who passes away and they have an autopsy performed, there are many families who don't wish to receive the results. And this addresses some of those concerns that we've received from families when they have told the coroners, you know, thank you, I understand an autopsy is performed, I appreciate that, but I physically, emotionally, mentally cannot, I don't want to hear the things of my child's findings. And this, the statute currently would require a coroner to do that. Now, again, it doesn't say that the coroner can't or won't. It simply says that they no longer have to provide those two separate notifications if maybe that family wouldn't wish to have that. So, again, I think it was a more compassionate approach, not necessarily trying to create barriers for families who do want the results, but to have a process for families that don't and would wish to not be notified of those results, sometimes 6 months, 8 months later.
Jenna?
Yep, that's what I was going to say, that the prior language required attempting to notify parents. There have been instances when parents have opened up an envelope, not realizing what it was, and it was the results of their child's autopsy, and it was traumatic to the parents. And so this language would avoid that issue of a parent being kind of blindsided by seeing an autopsy in the mail.
I just have this is not about the bill, but I just have a question. Why does it take 6 to 8 months to do an autopsy?
You know, that is a great question, and I will say that that would be the max length we would like to see for an autopsy findings, but many times they're going to outside entities for neuropath consultations, expanded toxicology, looking at different experts, cardiac pathologists. So it is usually in more unique cases where autopsies could take that long. There are many cases where autopsies are completed and finalized within a speedier process of, I would say, 1 to 3 months. That is fair.
So then another question about that. So if I'm, again, forgive me because I'm just trying to understand. So what this is saying now is the coroner will notify the family, we are going to do an autopsy. Mm-hmm. And at that same time, they're going to say, this is how, these are instructions on if you want to see the results of the autopsy, how you can get the copy, correct?
And provides them with their contact information.
So do they give them an idea, because you're saying parents call. I remember when my brother passed away at home, that my sister-in-law called several times, like, how long does this, you're thinking a couple of weeks, not months. And I think maybe that this would be the expectation of lots of parents as well. Mm-hmm. And is it in these instructions saying it could take this long?
I do feel like, I can't speak for all 105 coroners and then the district coroners, but there is consistency amongst looking at the individual situation and trying to provide the best updates to that family. And again, following up with families as they've requested. So I do see that happening across the state.
Thank you. Senator Thompson.
one suggestion, if this trauma is an issue, why don't we require the coroners, once the autopsy is complete, to send notification the autopsy results are available? If you'd like it, send it. Check a box, mail this back, or call this number, we'll send it. Something like that, I think, would be a much cleaner way, and that way, if they don't want to see it, they don't. Because I remember when my brother, it was like 6 months later, and I got an autopsy in the mail, and I found, oh, he died of that. It was completely different from what we thought. It was a surprise, but it wasn't shock. But yeah, I could see how with a kid. But if we just gave them the option, hey, it's available now. You know, you do this first notification. Here's how you can do it if you want it. And then once it's available, the coroner says, hey, we've got it available. Check a box, send it in. If we could add that language to clarify that process as a follow-up, I think that might clear this up. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Petty.
I'm just, it seems to me that saying and instructions for how a parent or legal guardian may obtain a copy of the findings and autopsy results does that.
If I may, well, it tells them how to get it, but it doesn't, you know, you might forget. Literally, my brother's it was about 6 months. I'd forgotten completely about it, and then it just came in the mail. So, it would be nice to be just notified, hey, they're available. I appreciate this amendment that gives them prior instruction here, because I think people don't know. They don't deal with this every day. They don't know how long this can take, and the prior information about that, I think, would be helpful. But then a follow-up reminder, I don't know. It just, to me, makes sense.
Could you answer the question? So it could take 6 months. Are they notified they're available now?
I mean, currently, I can't speak for every situation. That's not something that I see often in my records, but I wouldn't say probably 100% of the time. I don't believe that that is actually occurring, no.
So then I could see somebody going and checking this often. Oh, how traumatic for people during that 6-month period. I got the instructions, you can go here to try to get a copy, but if I'm not actually notified when that's going to happen. And it appears that what we struck was that they would be notified, right? When they were available.
Correct. But again, that wasn't something that was actually being done consistently. And when it was done, it was not always done in the best or most compassionate way for the family, such as an example of maybe receiving that report in the mail, as that would be the notification the coroner would provide versus having maybe a one-on-one conversation. So to save time, just mailing the report, which has been troublesome for families, versus at that initial time having the sit down to really explain this to the family, give them the resources so that they can access that when they're comfortable and wanting to.
And there's no sit down currently, right? It's just, it comes in the mail.
Well, I think different coroners do it different ways. I think some counties just provide it in the mail. I think many counties don't provide it at all unless it's requested from the parents.
Thank you. Committee, do we have any other questions? Senator Stephan.
Well, I certainly apologize for having read the bill, but the next can of worms, page 6, line 31, 32, and 33. I can certainly understand the heartburn with keeping records permanently. 15 years reading this last night struck me as very short. Then interestingly, I opened up the Hutchinson News newspaper this morning, and the headlines was that a guy was arrested for murder that was committed in 1982. So, what I don't know, the missing information for me here is, these reports, would they have any worth in an open investigation?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Senator. That is actually a great question. So when the board is reviewing these deaths, we're relying on written records from outside entities such as law enforcement, coroners, schools, et cetera, to which they are providing us a copy of. So once those records are obtained, we utilize them to complete our case review, which is, again, learning as much as we can about each unfortunate child death that is in front of us so that we can learn ways to prevent that as a state. The board rarely has to go backwards to re-review a case, and when we do that, it is on a much smaller window of time that is never neared anything close to the 15-year mark that we're proposing. In addition, we're not the ones who are creating many of these written reports, those original records are still retained within those agencies that sent them with us to begin with, meaning we're receiving a copy of the law enforcement report. Those are still available if there's an ongoing investigation or a need to further investigate. But essentially, we're utilizing those copies of records as a point-in-time review to learn as much as we can about that child. We don't need to usually go back to see those copies.
Additional questions? Senator Petty.
So I'll just follow up on that and ask the question that Senator Stephan did. It does say after the date a case is closed, so that could be well past 15 years. Would it?
I believe that thank you, Senator Petty. Madam Chair, I believe that is referring to 15 years after the board has completed its review determining cause, manners, and the risk factors and prevention points associated with that case. When the board has closed its review of that case, this would allow us to maintain those records as long as we need them, which could be more than 15 years, but would not require us to keep them permanently. Something to mention is that records that are our records, we won't go back and look at. We're looking at that case at one point in time. We don't go back and re-review for the data out of it. So it's not something that we find ourselves needing to go back and look at. And again, since they're copies of other reports from the original creators, I don't find that to be a barrier for other processes.
So this, as a follow-up, this is a 15-year window from when you have the materials on that particular case.
Correct, which is consistent with some of the other retention schedules at the Attorney General's office for case files, which is 16 years once a case is closed.
Thank you.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Sarah. Are those files, you're talking about the paper files, or are they digitized? I can understand the paper starting to pile up. But, everything's digital these days. I'm just wondering if you digitize them, keep them, or if that a labor-intensive process. It would. I can see how those could be, family members researching inherited traits. Somebody dies because of a congenital situation. I don't know. It just kind of came to mind that, if we destroy those records, they may not be able to find it out. I don't know. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Senator, that is a great point. I think it's something that I can mention that our records are closed. They are not available to the public. They're not allowed they're not subpoenaable, disclosable to the courts. They are completely sealed and for the purposes of the board only. So as those records couldn't be accessed by anyone other than the board, and the board isn't utilizing them to go backwards on, it really, this does make quite a bit of sense. And also to your point about digitizing records, that is very correct. Since 2015, that was the year I started with the Attorney General's Office and the State Child Death Review Board, we then streamlined all records to become digitized, and so those are retained. But we do have records back from the early 90s that are not. And if they were no longer necessary or needed for the board, those would be the ones that we may at some point want to work with the records retention policy to get those adjusted and not stored within house.
Additional questions, committee? Thank you very much. I would draw your attention to neutral written testimony only. This concludes our hearing on 2629. And we will now move to approval of the minutes. We have quite a few here, and these were sent out by Danola, I think, like a week or so ago. If you'd look those over. Were there any edits or amendments to the minutes? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we approve the minutes as received by the committee.
And do I have a second? Senator Holscher seconds. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Seeing none, the minutes have been approved. And committee, that concludes our work today. And
Madam Chair.
Committee, yes.
Could you give us inform us about the plan for working bills next week?
That agenda has already been sent out.
But it just says, I think it says bills will be worked, but it doesn't list bills that we're going to work.
Right, and that's because I don't know yet. It's going to depend on time, on how much time I think each of the hearing of the bills will take to know how long. But so just be prepared for us to work bills each of those days.
So it would be helpful if we had an idea.
Of course
like
it
the day
would,
before.
and I would tell you if I knew. Thank you.